Bay Area housing prices are so expensive for three reasons. The cost of land is very high in the Bay Area, and the cost of land is high because there's less land to build on, and just because it's just expensive by nature because it's located in the Bay Area, and a lot of people want to live in the Bay Area. But two, it's also the cost of development. And a lot of people don't understand the cost of development. It's not only buying the land, but also paying for the labor, paying for the materials, and more important, and probably just as expensive, is the whole process you have to go through to obtain entitlements. And as I explained to some people, as developers have to pay for the impacts that they impose, and sometimes even a little more than that. And the impact fees are about $100,000 a unit, and that in and of itself drives costs up for housing. If I could change one California housing policy, that would be not necessarily a housing policy, but a policy that relates to housing, and that's the California Environmental Quality Act. That was adopted in the 70s, and it had great intentions. However, it was only at the time it was passed, maybe 3 sections, and now it's over 700 sections with 500 case law to implement it. It's become so complicated, and you could use it as a sword or as a shield, and it has just really complicated the process. And people use it for litigation purposes and to extort or get things that they want. And it's really troubling because it's not being used the way it should be, but it really drives up the cost of housing. The biggest misconception public policy leaders have with respect to building housing is they look to the developer to fix all the problems, the existing problems. And it is true that the developers need to mitigate or address the impacts that they create. There's a lot of other issues out there that are not, that need to be fixed, and they look for the developer to do it. With the passage of Proposition 13 many years ago, we lost a huge resource for finances to put in the general fund, and without that, they really look to developers to fix those ill wills that are created. Yeah. The biggest misconception the public has is that developers, the development process is very easy, there's not much risk, and that they fail to mitigate the impacts that they impose or that they might create. And that's too bad. It takes there's a learning period to educate the public. Sometimes they don't want to hear, or they're just too busy. And as I've explained to many as I go through the process and represent clients, is the fact that through the California Environmental Quality Act, we're required to look at all the impacts that are created by the project, and we have to mitigate them. But when I also explain to them that it's the developer who's paying for the schools, for the police, for the fire, for the roads, through impact fees, and as I said, up to $100,000 a unit, they're actually shocked. But that's not common knowledge to the public. The single biggest barrier to building housing in the Bay Area is the number of regulations that are imposed. You have local regulations, you have regional regulations, and you have state regulations and even federal regulations. And sometimes they are conflicting. And so to be able to get around that conflict is very difficult, but also to understand and to know what all the different regulations are really hard. So for example, if you find land and there's housing on it or something on it and you want to demolish the land, the structures that are on it, you need a permit from BACMD, from the Bay Area Quality Management District, just to demolish. You need a 10-day waiting period. You need to go through the air quality regulations and standards to determine, if there's an issue with all of that. But then you've got to process your entitlement through the local agency and get the permits there. And then you've got to deal with the resource agencies, and then even some of the state agencies to get permits, and it's a very long, complicated process. And I said sometimes very conflicting. The legislature creates them, and they're broad policies, but then they say, for example, affordable housing. Okay, we have to provide affordable housing. That's a great housing policy. That's very important. And we have to have affordable housing in every community for every segment of the community. But when they give us that policy, they don't give us money to do it. So then they look for the developers to provide that affordable housing because they're the one who's building housing, and they can't provide it out of their pocket. So the real people who are providing the funds for that are the people who buy market rate housing. So it's circular. And when the state or even the federal government mandates a policy that requires finances to implement it, they have to pay for it. The state does, or the federal government. unless they exempt themselves out. So of course, every time they exempt themselves out. So that's kind of the conflict. And I also think when the state mandates something like that, they don't really understand how it's implemented and how the localities are sometimes, well, they're strong because they don't have the finances to implement them, but also a policy that might fit well for the whole state of California isn't easily implemented from local jurisdiction to local jurisdiction. So I think we have to have more housing policies that allow the local agencies to actually make the policy and not just implement it.